So I just drove up with my family, my wife, and 3 little kids. They're 2, 6, and 8, and they're roaming the campus. So be kind to them. If you see them, they're brave to come with me. So I'm sort of astonished sitting here listening to the speakers and hearing about story. It so resonates with what I think and what I've sort of hoped to hear about. In fact, in the car ride, I was talking about Tolkien and hope, and how hopeless, so much of how hopeless it all is in the books. But to hear the way it was framed was fantastic. So I have the opportunity to teach creative writing at San Diego City College. Anybody know San Diego City College? So it's an urban, very urban college, 17,000 students. You've got a range of, refugees from Africa and Southeast Asia to La Jolla High School kids coming in. It's an incredible mix. So when you teach a creative writing class there, the stories that come together are pretty unbelievable. If I ask students to write about, what is your greatest challenge? One of them was giving their senior speech. One of them was walking from Sudan to Kenya. And, that's a great equalizer. Talk about humility, when you hear that. So it's a really interesting place to teach. I think one of the assignments I give them is to write about a first time for anything. And I most recently asked them to write about their first kiss, which can be an awkward question for many students if there hadn't been one, or however it went. So my first kiss poem made it into my book, so I want to share that with you first. First kiss. Fat kids don't have girlfriends. Friends, yes, but not kissing. Not even in 3rd grade. So imagine my surprise when once, in the back seat of our 77 Caddy, on the drive home from the birthday party, Tanya, her quiet eyes in mine, put her braid on my shoulder and kissed me twice. The first kiss struck my nose, then squarely she found my lips. The next day at school, I spent hours staring out the window, my shoulder bending in memory of the braid. My fingers pushed against my mouth, trying to remember the cold suddenness of her lips and breath that made me. So when I teach story to my poetry students, they say, this is poetry. Why are we learning about story? But I always have them start out by writing narratives because I want them to be concrete, to focus on image. And then, then we get into other things that deal more in language poetry, etc. But they get really excited about that. They start to write image-driven poems. And then about the second poem, something happens. And maybe if you're writers out here, you'll know this. There's this lull, which is everything's already been written. I've got nothing to contribute. It's really a sad time in the class. It usually lasts about 2 weeks. And then I give this talk, which is either sounds very wise or it could sound really hokey. It depends on the audience, I'm not sure. But I'll say to them, the only new thing under the sun is you. Now, when you put it in context, it sounds better than it does probably right now. But when I say it to them, they're like, oh, wow. So I sort of give this as a wise statement, but when I was writing my own book, it happened to me, and it floored me. I was saying it to myself, I've got nothing. Who cares about my story? Why does it matter? So thankfully, my wife is also a writer, and she drilled me, as only a wife can, about value and identity. And she said, what are the themes of your story? And I realized one of the great themes, and the one I want to share with you for a few poems, is about reconciliation. So I was raised in New York City in a conservative Jewish household, practicing with a pretty large extended family. And they were Zionist, extremely so, loving people, and really loved Israel, loved the culture. We lived in Brooklyn, Long Island, New York City, but I was raised hearing things like, there is no Palestine. The only good Palestinian is a dead Palestinian. And as a kid growing up, you don't always rebel against statements like that. You sort of just take them in and let it float in there, because the people you love and care for most and who care for you are saying these things, so you don't necessarily fight back against that. But it never necessarily sat well with me. So it was always there, but when I turned 30 and I actually had my own crazy story happen where I actually began to follow Jesus, it crystallized something for me about reconciliation, and I realized that not only was it something was off, something was really off. And to understand it better, I had to make Aliyah. I had to go back to Israel. I had to go to Israel and see for myself what was going on and what this story of reconciliation meant for me. So I want to read you a few poems from the book that deal with that particular trip and how reconciliation happened. And to write it, I will say just about process, that I had to have a certain measure of faith that my story about reconciliation would matter to others. And that's a great part of the faith of being a writer. Making Aliyah. Because we can think, we are afraid of the dark. At night, from the bottom bunk, in the middle of the 70s top 10, just after another one bites the dust, the radio light glowing against the blackness, I slide off my bed, get on my knees, and give thanks that God made me. Ask him to help me understand why the screaming has to echo so loudly down the hall, why he has to call her that, why she can't be kind to him. I listen for my parents because Jewish kids don't pray like this, not hands folded like this, and not on knees, something from TV. When the moon is full, I sometimes can find my face imprinted on the surface, that the cosmic dust that strikes it formed the pattern of my life. At 13, when they call me to the Torah, I speak in muted prayers, sewn into me through countless afternoons with the rabbi. No revelry, no celebration, just me, my father, the rabbi, and 100 anonymous others looking on. I wait for manhood to come over me. I notice the women are upstairs, that the rabbi's breath smells like coffee, that I'm cold. After a while, I look up into the stained glass near the temple ceiling, waiting for a change to happen. Some touch from the Almighty, something to make it true. There's a feeling like being folded in half. By the end of the day, I make a promise that I'll go to Israel. She is young, brown hair in a straight fall from her baseball cap pulled tightly around her head. She's not tall, I can't see her eyes, but her lips are full and her mouth moves softly. She demands I follow her into hidden places, wander for years. I spend my reality on her. She folds her hands in mine, pulls my fingers to her desperate face, spreads my palm on her cheek, and gently guides it down softly along the smoothness of her neck, the rounds of her shoulders, so warm beneath her uniform, my hand tracing the outline of her breast. This isn't my life. We sit and talk about religion when it's late and she's already had a few glasses of wine. We decide that it must be that every Christian must question eternity at least 3 times. More wine until we find ourselves agreeing that Adam and Eve are real, but single-celled. The garden no bigger than a pinch of water, evolution just as God had planned it. 1 foot toward Mecca, 1 foot in the temple. One hand folded, prayer over prayer beads, the other in an open meditation. My mind is unfastened to the loudest voice. Reverence for life, sit beneath trees, find my chi, open my heart. Big church doors and school cafeterias, there is not food enough for the hunger of God. The seeds in our blood cannot be dug out. They take root in the flow, sprout 1,000 paths that we try not to follow. This is why I step off the plane into the place of dry bones. My hands close and open in the sun. I come here by a promise and find a covenant from sky to sky and earth. So when I got there, many great things happened. How many of you have ever traveled to Israel? Anyone? It was an incredible trip. I was able to travel, obviously, through a lot of the Holy Land, so to speak, but I also wanted to be in the West Bank. I needed to see for myself what it was like to meet these people I was taught to hate, and knowing that was untrue, to see what happened. And I ended up through a long series of adventures, really, and there's some of them in the book, walking hand in hand with a friend I made through Akbat Jaber refugee camp in Jericho. And I spent a lot of time there. and learned more about humanity probably in that few days than I learned really in my whole life. And there are a number of poems about the reconciliation that took place by just being there. And by the way, being really afraid. It's amazing how much we store up that we're not aware of. I will say that for me, as I tried to write this, because I also write essays, I've tried to write essays about this experience I've been unable to. I can't explore the way I want to, but poetry allows me, through imagery, giving imagery the job to evoke the emotion, I'm able to deal with it more concisely, more powerfully, more effectively, at least for now. 200 feet below the sea, Akbat Jaber refugee camp, West Bank, Israel. Banana farmers beg the sun to be merciful. Deep in the earth, water waits to spill up into the dirt washes that become baskets of bottle green, filled with busheled leaves grown wild in the air of the Dead Sea. The refugee town buildings reach brick by brick, and I walk with Suleiman arm in arm, beyond nervous, remembering that I don't look Jewish, in a place where a notion of this part of me might cause me to disappear. Secret streets deserted to eyes used to busy streets, until behind one broken red door, framed into an unfinished heap of cinder blocks, I see you, little one, staring at me, and I smile. I imagine the strains of you, the split-hair life you lead in the quiet doorway. It's hot today in January, here in this bowl below the sea, the scorching air packed in the doorframe, and you step back into the dark brick. What do you see? This tall man, pale in the golden sun, away from who he is. Can you have compassion for me? Can you see hope? Not because of what I can bring you, but because I might want to meet you. I pause for a moment, and Suleiman looks at me, patient, curious. What I want to say to her is, come out from behind that doorway. Be beautiful. Live. Live. I want to ask you about what it meant to be alive in this place, your home, through wrecked gates, through viral water, through sheep's dung and black smoke, the lonely caress of waiting. But I say nothing because I'm afraid, because in a place like this, I have no rights, just as she has no rights. I turn to Suleiman and ask him if he knows this little girl. He looks at the doorway, smiles at the insignificance of my question. He's not cruel, just my question is so out of place in his experience. He mumbles something in Arabic, or maybe in English. It will be later on in the afternoon at Suleiman's house, sharing stories, taking tea along the wash filled up with garbage, the smell of honey more rich than trash. When I will see the tiny figure, the long black hair of the little girl walking toward us, keeping her distance but still looking. Even as I pretend that I didn't notice her, her eyes turn me inside out. How did I get here? I remember a sensation of running in my legs, dust in my eyes, thirst. Thank you.